Terminal services is an extremely popular technology that's likely to be found in most companies, small or large. But there comes a time where you'll want your users to be able to access their applications from outside your corporate network. Now, these guys might be mobile users that are connecting from anywhere in the world, or even just a user connecting from home needing to do some work. Now, whatever the case, we need to find a way to allow these guys to hit up our corporate network and access their applications from anywhere. And that's exactly what the Terminal Services Gateway Role Service is designed for. It's a role service that allows users to connect to our terminal servers that live behind our firewalls without the need for VPNs. So let's take a look at what would be a typical setup, and we'll see how we can use our TS Gateway role in our network so we're able to give this access to our users. So when we have a user, let's say he's a mobile user, he or she of course is a mobile user, that's my effort at drawing a laptop right there, and they want to access our terminal server under normal circumstances from inside our network. They're just going to go and connect to our terminal server. This will be our TS server right here. They're going to connect to it back and forth using port 3389. Now that's great, but what happens when that user steps outside our corporate network and wants to connect? Well, port 3389 is typically blocked from the outside. So for these users, we are really going to want to deploy another machine called the TS Gateway. We'll just abbreviate it as TSGW, which is going to allow them to connect to our internal terminal servers. So perhaps we've got a user over here who happens to be working from home or the beach. It doesn't matter as long as they've got a working internet connection. So they are going to want to connect over the internet through our border firewall. We'll just draw a little firewall there. That's my effort at drawing a firewall. They're going to connect through our firewall, and that connection is going to hit our Terminal Services Gateway. Now, it's our Terminal Services Gateway server that's obviously sitting inside our DMZ, so I'll have to draw another firewall there. It's this server's job to handle that back and forth communication to our terminal server that lives inside our corporate network, where this user can get access to their applications. Now, here's the cool part. When this user here out on the internet wants to connect to our gateway server, this communication all happens over the SSL port of 443, the standard port that most companies already allow through their firewall. So when this traffic here hits our gateway can then use regular traffic over port 3389 to the remote app server. Now that's pretty cool because it means that you don't need to open up your border firewall for other traffic. You could do this just using the regular SSL 443 port, and in most cases that's going to mean no additional configuration or ports need to be opened. Now even so, there will be some of you listening to this video right now that mightn't want to have your TS Gateway server here sitting out there in your DMZ, or you don't want to open up port 3389 to your internal network from your DMZ. Now that's okay, because if you do have a firewall like ISA Server 2006, you can then have ISA Server handle that connection for you. So in that case, we would simply take our gateway server here and we'd replace it with an ISA server, and we'd remove our gateway server and we'd put it right here inside our corporate network. So essentially now we would have a firewall here. We would have our border firewall here. And obviously there's the internet and our mobile users. So by deploying a setup like this, whereby ISA server is now going to take the place of our TS gateway server inside our DMZ, our gateway server can now sit inside our corporate network. This also means that our gateway, our TS gateway, let's just label that there, our TS gateway can now freely talk with our Terminal Services remote app server over port 3389, because obviously they're both inside our network. They can do what they like, and that's fine. But the communication that's coming from the ISA server, which is now taking our incoming 443 connections out from the internet, that communication will now be able to travel through our internal firewall using either HTTP or HTTPS, depending on how you want to set it up. Now, one last thing to remember though is that if you do want to use ISA server in place of your gateway inside your DMZ, then you will need to install the gateway's server certificate on the ISA server in order for this to work. So I've just switched over to our terminal server here, TS1. So let's go and fire up the Server Manager console. We're going to go and expand roles. Terminal services. We'll expand TS Gateway Manager, and we'll select our server here, TS1. So this is where you'll not only go to create your gateway authorization policies, but also to find out what this server's up to. For example, up the top right here, you can see how many connections that we've got on this gateway right now, how many users are connected as well, and the resources that they're actually using. And if you want to dig a little deeper, we can click this Monitor Active Connections link, and that's going to take us straight to this monitoring folder here. And in this window, you'll be able to see who or what is using these connections. You'll be able to see things like where they're actually coming from, and of course where they're connecting to. All right, now back on our TS1 server here in the middle of this console, we've got the configuration status section, and this is where we'll set up our authorization policies. And there's two types of policies that we need to concern ourselves with. We have the connection authorization policy and the resource authorization policy, the CAP and the RAP. Now you can see here by these yellow warning icons that we don't yet have any policies defined. However, when you installed your own terminal server, you might have chosen to create a policy at that time. Now, I didn't do that. That's why mine here is empty. So we'll need to create them now. But before we do that, directly underneath here, we've got this checklist of the things that we'll need to do in order to configure our TS gateway. So let's just take a look so we make sure that we understand each step that's involved. All right, well, up the top here, it tells us the first thing we need to do is to install the TS Gateway Role Service. Right, well, I wouldn't be here looking at this checklist if I hadn't done that already. So check for the first step there. Step number 2 is to install a certificate. Now, when we installed our server back in the first video, we also had the choice to use a certificate to set it up later, or to use a self-signed certificate. Now, we chose to use a self-signed certificate for this lab, so we're good there. Step number 3 is to create the TS CAP, the Connection Authorization Policy, which of course we're going to do in a moment. Step 4 is to create the TS RAP, the Resource Authorization Policy. And the last step is to configure our RDP client so that it knows how to connect to our gateway. Okay, so these two authorization policies here are the next steps in our quest for a working TS gateway. So let's close this help file. And we're going to click this first link here to create a connection authorization policy. Now, one thing that'll probably strike you as we create this policy is that it's an incredibly easy and an incredibly logical thing to set up. This TS CAP simply defines how and which users are allowed to connect to our server. And that's basically it in a nutshell. We are now going to tell our gateway which users are allowed to connect to it. Not what terminal servers they're allowed to access, not what applications they're allowed to use. All that stuff comes later. Right now, we're only concerned with who's even allowed to connect to this gateway. Okay, so let's get started. What do we need to do? We need to enter in a name for this policy. So I'm going to make this policy specifically for members of my sales team. So we're going to call this policy Sales. And we're going to leave this checkbox here to enabled, as we'll want this policy to take effect once we create it. Let's move over to the second tab, the Requirements tab. And in here, we'll need to choose what sort of authentication will allow these salespeople to connect with. Now, the default is to use a password, but we can also use a smart card, or we could use both options if we like. Now, do take note, though, that if you do select both, it tells you here that either of these two options will be accepted as a valid authentication method. You don't need to authenticate with both of these separately. So you can accept both types of authentication, but to successfully connect, only one of them is required. Now, next we can choose which groups of users or which groups of computers are allowed to connect using the standard Active Directory find window, which we've all seen before. So let's click Add Group. I'm going to type in Sales and click Check Names. All right, well, there's our group. Let's click OK. Of course, we can add in as many groups as we like. All right, that's fine. Now, I'm not going to fill in the computer group membership window here, but let's say you've got a sales user group. You might like to use a group of computers to specify salespeople that use notebook computers, for example. You might want to configure it that way. All right, well, let's move over to our final tab, the Device Redirection. And here, we're able to choose whether or not we want to enable or disable client device redirection. Those are things like our hard drives, our clipboard, our printers, you can see them down here, serial ports, and the plug-and-play devices. Now, these are the devices that we've got on our local machine. They'll be made available by default in our remote session. So, do you want them to be made available to remotely connecting users? Yes or no? Well, if the answer is yes, you don't need to do anything because that's already the default selection. If the answer is no, then you can choose to disable redirection for all of the devices except for any smart cards, or you can simply choose which ones you want to exclude. All right, well, that's it. Pretty simple interface, pretty easy to set up. We'll click OK, and we're done. There's our policy up the top. When we select it, down in this bottom section here, we'll be able to see the policy rules and how they apply. So if the user's a member of the following group, the sales group, and they are authenticated via a password, then they'll be allowed in. I told you it was easy. All right, well, that's the first half of our setup, the connection. We've now defined a policy, a TS cap, that allows users that are members of our sales group to connect. But they won't have access to any computers until we create the next policy, which is a Resource Authorization Policy, or a TS wrap. So let's click on TS1 Local again, and we're going to choose the next link here to create our wrap policy. Again, we've got another pretty easy window that pops up with a few tabs here to complete. Firstly, we'll need to enter a name. I'm going to call this Sales again. I'm going to skip the description here for my lab, and we're going to enable this policy. Now, on our Users and Groups tab, we'll need to define which user groups can connect to our remote terminal servers. So let's click Add again. Like before, I'm going to add in the Sales group and click OK. Now, on the Computer Groups tab, this is where we'll define the terminal servers that users of this policy are able to connect to. So we can choose from an existing Active Directory security group. Now, if you use this option, then you'll need to go to Active Directory Users and Computers and then create a group and add the computer account for the terminal services into that group to allow those people to connect to it. Now, or another option we have here is to create a group by selecting the middle option, clicking Browse. Since we don't have any groups at the moment, we'll click Create New Group. We'll need to give this group a name. I'm going to call this Sales Terminal Services or Terminal Servers. And on our Network Resources tab, we'll then need to add in the name of our terminal server or the IP address. So let's just type in TS1. That's the name of our server. We'll click Add. And of course, we can add in multiple if we like. We'll click OK. OK again. And there's now the server that these users connecting will be able to get access to. Now, our final option, of course, is to allow users to connect to any network resources. Now, that's certainly going to be the easiest option to configure. Just check this button and that's it. But that might be giving up access to more servers than you'd like. Now, on our final tab here, Allowed Ports, we can choose what ports will allow communication to take place on. Now, the default is to use port 3389, the standard port. We can choose our own port if we like, or allow connections through any ports. Now, in most cases, you are going to go straight with the defaults, which I'm going to do, and we'll just click OK. Now, from the server's perspective, this is all up and running. The TS Gateway will now allow members of our sales group to connect to our TS1 server through this gateway. We've got a connection policy that allows users to connect to our gateway, and we've got a resource policy allowing them access to our actual terminal server. Now, the only thing that we need to do now is to configure the RDP client to point to our gateway for these remote connections. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can do this, the hard way and the easy way. The truth is, though, that in the long run, if I configure this the easy way, it's going to end up being the hard way. And the hard way now is going to end up being the easy way. What do I mean by that? Well, let's see. Let's do the easy method first. So I've just switched over to my domain controller for a moment because I can show both of these methods from my domain controller. So let's go with the easy method. The easy method is simply this. Let's click Start and let's open up a remote desktop connection. Now I'm going to choose Options, then the Advanced tab, then the Settings button, and I'm going to choose this radio button here to use these TS gateway server settings, and then we'll need to enter in the fully qualified domain name of our gateway server. So for me, that's going to be ts1.jawkes.com. Now then we can choose to use a logon method. We can allow users to select it later, password or smart card. We've seen those options before. We can bypass our gateway server for any local addresses if we're logging on from inside our corporate network, for example. And down the bottom here, we're also able to use our TS gateway credentials for logging onto our terminal server as well. All right, so fill all this in, click OK, and that's it. That's the easy method. However, this method is hard in the long run because if you've got a lot of users, you're going to either have to explain how to do that for each of your users and get them to do it, or run around to every user's desktop and do it for them. No thanks. So the hard option is to use group policy, which will involve a little bit more work now, but a lot less work in the long run. And of course, that's the method that I'd prefer to use. So let's cancel this. Let's click Start, and we're going to go to Administrative Tools, fire up the Group Policy Management Console. Now I'm just going to edit my default domain policy here. So let's just expand out our domain, right click and choose Edit. And under our user configuration heading here, we're going to expand policies, administrative templates, Windows components. Let's expand this out so we can see it. Terminal services, let's expand that and select TS Gateway. Now over on the right hand side, we've got a couple of policies that are useful. We can set our authentication method, which allows us to simply use a smart card or a password. Now we can also enable or disable the ability of our users to connect to our TS Gateway server. But right now the option that we're mainly interested in is this bottom one, to set our TS Gateway server address. So let's right click, choose Properties, and we're going to set this to Enabled, and then we just enter in the name of our server, which of course was ts1.jawkes.com. Now at the top here we can also allow users to change this setting as well, which is not really a bad idea. Just in case something changes and you need to be able to connect to a different gateway, you can give your users that flexibility. Now once we go ahead and click OK and this policy comes into effect, our users will have the gateway configured for them, and that's going to save them from having to do it themselves, and that's going to save your staff from receiving a lot of help desk calls. So in this video, we've talked about the Terminal Services Gateway Role Service, a very useful role that allows users to connect to your terminal servers and access their applications over the internet without the need for a VPN. Now, as you saw, it's remarkably easy to configure a TS gateway. It's all rather logical, and there's really no reason why you can't now make your applications available for your users from pretty much anywhere. So we hope you've enjoyed this video, and we'd like to thank you for watching.